The coral bit into their hands like broken glass. November 20th, 1943, 500 yards offshore from Betio Island. The first wave of Marines crouched behind the steel walls of their Higgins boats as the dawn turned the Pacific from black to grey to blood orange. Through the spray and diesel smoke, they could see it. A sliver of land barely 300 acres, flat as a dinner plate, crowned with palm stumps and concrete. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki had promised the emperor that this fortress could not fall. 1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years, he had declared to his officers. The Americans had 76 hours to prove him wrong. The boat's ramp dropped, seawater flooded in, warm and salt-thick. Before them stretched a lagoon glittering with morning light and 500 yards of death. The Japanese had spent over a year turning Betio into something unprecedented in the Pacific War. Not just a base, but a conviction made of steel and coral, and the certainty that some ground could never be taken. Beneath the island's crust, they had poured concrete until the earth itself became armour. Blockhouses stood 8 feet thick, reinforced with steel rails scavenged from the narrow-gauge railway that once carried copra to the docks. Coconut logs, 4 feet in diameter, were stacked in layers and lashed with wire, creating walls that could withstand naval shells designed to crack battleships. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Admiral Shibasaki was not a boastful man by nature. He was 51 years old, a career naval officer educated in the old Meiji tradition where discipline meant silence and confidence required no advertisement. But Tarawa was different. When he inspected the fortifications in September of 1943, walking the perimeter of Betio with his staff, he did not see an island. He saw a theorem proven in concrete. The math was simple, he explained to Commander Takeo Sugai. The reef would stop their landing craft. The wire would stop their infantry. The guns would stop their will. 4,800 men of the Special Naval Landing Forces held the island. Elite troops, not conscripts. Men who had trained in amphibious warfare, in night fighting, in the particular cruelty required to defend coral atolls where there was no retreat, no hinterland, only the choice between holding or drowning. They had been told explicitly that rescue would not come. Reinforcement was a fantasy. Surrender was treason. Their purpose was singular. To make the Americans bleed so badly that the march across the Pacific would slow, falter, and eventually stop, Shibasaki had studied American doctrine. He knew they relied on firepower, on the assumption that enough shells and bombs could flatten any defense, so he built deeper. Underneath Betio's surface, his engineers carved a network of shelters and tunnels connecting pillboxes to command posts, ammunition stores to hospital bunkers. When the bombardment came, and it would come, his men would simply go underground and wait. Then, when the barrage lifted and the Americans waded ashore, they would emerge and kill them in the shallows. The island bristled with weapons. 8-inch naval guns taken from British shore batteries captured in Singapore. 70mm howitzers positioned to sweep the beaches with interlocking fire. 14 coastal defense guns, each capable of sinking a destroyer. Heavy machine guns, over 100 of them, sited to create kill zones where no man could cross and live. Anti-boat obstacles studded the lagoon. Coconut log barriers, barbed wire strung on iron stakes, mines buried in the sand, and everywhere, trenches. Not shallow foxholes, but deep firing positions faced with sandbags and coral, designed so a man could stand, fire, and duck without exposing more than his helmet. The Marines called it Fortress Betio before they ever saw it. Intelligence officers studying reconnaissance photos in Hawaii could barely believe what they were seeing. One described it as a giant aircraft carrier made of coral, bristling with guns. Another said simply, "It's going to be hell." But strategy demanded it. Tarawa sat in the Gilbert Islands, the gateway to the Marshall Islands, which themselves opened the road to the Marianas and eventually Japan. The Central Pacific Drive, as the planners called it, could not bypass Betio. The airfield there, still under construction, would allow Japanese bombers to strike American supply lines stretching back to Pearl Harbor. It had to be taken. The question was not whether to assault Tarawa, but whether enough men could be found to do it. Major General Julian Smith, commander of the 2nd Marine Division, requested 10 days of naval bombardment before the landing. He was given 3 hours. He asked for additional Amtraks, the tracked amphibious vehicles that could cross the reef where boats could not. He received 75, barely a third of what he needed. When he voiced concerns about the tide, about whether the water would be deep enough for the Higgins boats to clear the reef, he was told the neap tide would provide at least 5 feet of clearance. It was a guess, not a guarantee, and guesses, in war, are paid for in blood. The night before the assault, the Marines aboard the transport ships tried to sleep. Some wrote letters. Others cleaned rifles for the 3rd or 4th time, checking each spring and pin as though ritual could ward off death. A chaplain moved among them, offering communion and quiet words. One Marine, a boy from Nebraska, barely 19 years old, asked if it was true that the Japanese never surrendered. The chaplain hesitated before answering. "It's true," he said, "but neither do we." At 0300 hours on November 20th, the naval bombardment began. Battleships, Maryland and Colorado, opened fire, their 16-inch guns hurling shells the size of automobiles toward the invisible island. Cruisers added their voices, then destroyers closing to point-blank range. For 2.5 hours the sea erupted. Flames leapt hundreds of feet into the air. Smoke blotted out the stars. Aboard the transports, Marines watched the spectacle and allowed themselves a moment of hope. Surely nothing could survive that. Surely the island was already dead. But deep beneath the coral, Admiral Shibasaki sat in his command bunker, feeling the earth shake with each impact. Dust sifted from the concrete ceiling. The single electric bulb swung on its cord, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. His staff waited in silence, eyes on their commander. When the barrage finally paused, Shibasaki stood, adjusted his uniform, and said calmly, "Gentlemen, the Americans have announced their arrival. Now we will teach them the cost of uninvited guests." Above ground, the island smouldered. Palm trees had been shredded into splinters. Entire sections of beach had been churned into craters. But the bunkers, the deep positions, the interlocking machine gun nests remained. The bombardment had been spectacular. It had also been insufficient. As the first wave of Marines loaded into their landing craft, the sun broke the horizon. It would be a beautiful day. Clear skies, calm seas, perfect visibility. Perfect for the defenders to see every man crossing the lagoon. Perfect for killing. The Marines of the 2nd Division were not naive. They had fought on Guadalcanal. They knew the Japanese did not break easily. But Tarawa was different in a way none of them could yet articulate. It was not a jungle to be cleared or a ridge to be taken. It was a gauntlet, a furnace, a mathematical problem written in bullets and blood, 500 yards of open water, a reef that might or might not allow passage. And on the other side, men who believed with absolute certainty that their fortress could not fall. As the boats circled, waiting for the signal to advance, a young lieutenant looked toward Betio and muttered, "It's just a sandbar." His sergeant, a veteran of Tulagi, shook his head. "That sandbar's gonna eat us alive." Both men were right. At 0830 hours, the first wave began its run toward shore. Engines roared, spray flew, and from the island, silence. The Japanese watched and waited, fingers resting lightly on triggers, following orders older than memory. Let them come close, let them believe, then kill them all. Betio did not look like a fortress from the sea. It looked like something already dead. But beneath the shattered palms and smoking coral, 4,800 men crouched in the dark, and in his bunker, Admiral Shibasaki checked his watch and smiled. Let the Americans come, he thought. Let them test the mathematics of courage against concrete. He believed, with the faith of a man who had done the calculations, that his island could not be taken. Not in 100 years. Not by 1,000,000 men. The Marines would have 76 hours to teach him otherwise. The reef appeared without warning. One moment the Higgins boats were racing toward shore, propellers churning white water. The next they ground to a shuddering halt as steel met coral, 500 yards from the beach. Exactly where the map said there would be 5 feet of water, there was barely 3. The neap tide had failed them. Or perhaps the calculations had been wrong from the start. It no longer mattered. The boats could go no further. Ramps dropped into waist-deep water. The Marines hesitated for a single breath, then stepped into the lagoon. Instantly, the island came alive. Machine guns opened fire from positions invisible behind smoke and rubble. Tracer rounds streaked across the water like burning wires. Mortar shells began dropping, precise and methodical, walking up and down the reef where hundreds of men now stood exposed, holding rifles above their heads, trying to wade through water that seemed to thicken with every step. Private First Class Robert Sherrod, a Time magazine correspondent who had convinced the Marine Corps to let him land with the assault troops, would later write that the sound was unlike anything he had imagined. Not a roar, but a hum, a constant metallic whine of bullets passing overhead, punctuated by the wet smack of rounds hitting water or flesh. Men fell without crying out. Others simply disappeared beneath the surface, dragged down by 60 pounds of gear, and never came up. The Amtraks, the 75 tracked vehicles that could cross the reef, became the only lifeline. They churned past the stranded boats, their drivers hunched low, pushing toward shore with loads of Marines clinging to every surface. Japanese gunners targeted them immediately. Anti-tank rounds punched through thin armor. One Amtrak took a direct hit from a 70mm gun and simply disintegrated, scattering bodies across the water like debris from a broken toy. Another made it to the seawall before a hidden pillbox opened fire at point-blank range, killing everyone inside in under 3 seconds. On the beach, those who survived the crossing found themselves pinned against a 3-foot seawall made of coconut logs. It provided the only cover on an island that had none. Behind them, the lagoon was filling with bodies. Ahead, barely 20 yards away, Japanese bunkers spat fire from slits so narrow they seemed like cracks in the earth. Marines tried to advance and were cut down before they moved 10 feet. They tried to dig in, but the coral would not yield to entrenching tools. They tried to call for support, but radios soaked in seawater had gone silent. Major Jim Crow, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, landed in the 3rd wave. His boat stuck on the reef like all the others. He climbed over the side and began walking, his Thompson submachine gun held high, his voice calm and absurdly steady. "Keep moving," he shouted to the men around him. "If you stop, you die." Bullets stitched the water around him. Men to his left and right crumpled and sank. Crow kept walking, as if death were simply a matter of poor timing that could be avoided through momentum alone. It took him 40 minutes to cross 500 yards. When he finally reached the seawall, fewer than half the men who had started with him were still alive. He collapsed against the logs, gasping, and looked back at the reef. The water had turned pink, then red, then a darker shade that reminded him of rust. Bodies floated face down, rolling gently in the current. Packs and helmets drifted like flotsam. A flamethrower tank burned in the shallows, black smoke pouring into the perfect blue sky. Crow turned to his radio operator. "Tell them we're ashore," he said. The radio man, a kid from Ohio with blood running from his ear, shook his head. "Radio's dead, sir." Crow nodded as though he had expected it. "Then I guess we're on our own." By 1000 hours, the assault had stalled completely. 3 battalions had landed, only a fraction had made it to the seawall. The rest were scattered across the reef, dead or dying or hiding behind the bodies of their friends. Japanese fire had not slackened. If anything, it had intensified, as though the defenders had been waiting for the Americans to commit fully before unleashing everything they had. Admiral Shibasaki, watching from his command bunker through a periscope jury-rigged from a submarine, allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The Americans had come as predicted. They had died as predicted. His officers stood nearby, counting the minutes, waiting for the inevitable withdrawal. But Shibasaki was not celebrating. He knew the mathematics of attrition. The Americans had more men, more ships, more of everything. The question was not whether they could take Tarawa, but whether they would pay the price. So far, they were paying. On the beach, the Marines did what Marines do when everything goes wrong. They fought anyway. Small groups began moving, crawling along the seawall, using corpses for cover, inching toward the pillboxes that were killing them. Flamethrowers were brought forward, their operators knowing they carried death on their backs but advancing anyway because someone had to. Engineers placed satchel charges against bunker doors and blew them open, only to be shot by Japanese soldiers emerging from connecting tunnels. One pillbox, a massive concrete structure with walls 8 feet thick, held up an entire company for 2 hours. Marines fired rifle grenades at the gun slits. They threw hand grenades through openings barely 6 inches wide. Nothing worked. Finally, a lieutenant named William Dean Hawkins, called Hawk by his men, crawled to within 10 feet of the position and shoved a flamethrower nozzle directly into the firing port. He held the trigger down until the screaming stopped. Then he moved to the next bunker and did it again. Hawkins had been wounded twice that morning. He refused evacuation. By noon, he had destroyed 4 pillboxes and was working on a 5th when a burst of machine gun fire caught him in the chest. He died on the sand, still trying to reload. For his actions, he would receive the Medal of Honor. The island would later name its airfield after him. But in that moment, he was just another body on a beach that had already claimed hundreds. The tide, which had betrayed the Marines in the morning, finally turned in their favor by early afternoon. Water deepened over the reef. More Amtraks could cross. Reinforcements began trickling ashore. Though shore was a generous term for the narrow strip of blood-soaked coral where men fought without room to maneuver. By 1500 hours, elements of 6 battalions were on Betio, most of them packed into a space barely 200 yards wide. Colonel David Shoup, commanding the assault, had set up his command post in a wrecked Japanese bunker just behind the seawall. He had been wounded in the leg during the landing but refused morphine because he needed to think clearly. Around him, runners came and went, carrying messages because the radios were still largely useless. The reports were uniformly grim. Casualties were catastrophic. Ammunition was running low. Water was scarce. The Japanese seemed infinite. Shoup scrawled a message and handed it to a runner heading back to the ships. Issue in doubt. 3 words that would become infamous. Not a request for withdrawal, but a simple statement of fact. The most powerful military in the world had thrown everything it had at 300 acres of coral, and after 8 hours, the outcome remained uncertain. Aboard the command ship offshore, Admiral Harry Hill read the message and felt something close to despair. He had promised the Marines 3 hours of bombardment would be enough. He had assured them the tide would cooperate. He had believed, as they all had, that American firepower could overcome any defense. Now he stared at the reports of casualties pouring in and realized that certainty, like coral, could break a man. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On Betio, the Japanese were also bleeding. The naval bombardment, while insufficient to destroy the fortifications, had killed hundreds of defenders. The constant marine assaults were grinding down positions one by one, but Admiral Shibasaki had planned for attrition. His men knew there was no retreat. They fought from one bunker until it was overrun, then fell back to another, then another, each position buying minutes or hours. Time, Shibasaki believed, was the weapon that would break American resolve. Night fell over Tarawa like a curtain. The Marines, accustomed to Japanese banzai charges after dark, dug in and waited. Flares hung in the sky, casting the island in sickly green light. Machine guns fired at shadows. Men whispered to each other, checking that their neighbors were still alive, still awake, still human. The smell was already unbearable. Coral dust, cordite, seawater, and death all mixed into an atmosphere that clung to the lungs like oil. The expected counterattack never came. Shibasaki had forbidden it. "Let the Americans sit in the dark," he ordered. "Let them imagine what morning will bring." Psychological warfare required no bullets, but his officers were growing uneasy. American ships still crowded the horizon. More troops were landing under cover of darkness. The mathematics were shifting. By dawn of November 21st, the second day, the Marines had carved out a foothold. It was shallow, precarious, and bought with the lives of over 1,500 men. But it was real. Shoup, limping and pale but still upright, gathered his officers for a conference in the open because there was nowhere else to meet. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice rough from shouting and smoke, "we're going to take this island. Today." One major, his uniform stiff with dried blood, laughed bitterly. "With what, sir?" Shoup pointed inland. "With rage." The assault resumed at 0600 hours. This time, the Marines had learned. They stopped trying to charge the bunkers head-on. Instead, they used flamethrowers, demolitions, and close-quarters brutality to crack each position. Tanks, the few that had made it ashore, rolled forward with infantry clinging to their sides. They would stop at a pillbox, the infantry would dismount and suppress the firing ports, and the tank would fire point-blank until the concrete crumbled. Progress was measured in yards. Each bunker cleared meant another 10 feet of ground. Each tunnel collapsed meant one less position to worry about. But the cost remained staggering. Flamethrower operators lasted minutes before being targeted. Tank crews abandoned burning vehicles and fought as infantry. Corpsmen ran through fire to drag wounded men to makeshift aid stations where doctors operated under palm fronds with instruments sterilized in seawater. By midday, the Marines had pushed inland nearly 300 yards. They had overrun the first line of defences and were closing on the airfield. Japanese resistance, while still fierce, had begun to fragment. Communication between bunkers was breaking down. Ammunition was running short, and critically, water was gone. The defenders, who had stockpiled supplies for a siege, found that American shells had ruptured their cisterns. Men fought with cracked lips and swollen tongues, their discipline fraying under the twin pressures of thirst and despair. Admiral Shibasaki knew the end was approaching. His bunker had been hit twice during the night. Part of the ceiling had collapsed, killing his communications officer. The radios were silent. Reports from his subordinates had stopped coming. When he ventured above ground to observe the situation, he saw Marines everywhere, advancing methodically, their faces blackened with coral dust and caked blood, moving like machines that had forgotten how to stop. He returned to his bunker and wrote a final message to Tokyo. "The enemy has landed. We are holding. But our situation is deteriorating. We will fight to the end." He sealed the message and handed it to a runner, though he suspected no runner would make it through the American lines. Then he sat down, checked his pistol, and waited. On the afternoon of the second day, a Marine patrol found him. He was standing in the entrance to his command post, uniform immaculate, sword drawn. He said something in Japanese that none of the Marines understood. Then he raised the sword. A corporal fired 3 rounds from his M1. Shibasaki fell backward into the bunker, dead before he hit the ground. His death changed nothing tactically. The defenders did not know their commander had fallen. But, symbolically, it marked the moment when mathematics gave way to reality. The island that could not be taken in 100 years had 50 hours left. The third day began with silence. Not peace, but the exhausted quiet of men who had been killing and dying for 48 hours without pause. The Marines who woke on the morning of November 22nd did so slowly, checking first that they still had all their limbs, then that their weapons still functioned, then finally that the man beside them was breathing. Some were not. Bodies lay where they had fallen, too many to move, too numerous to count. The living stepped over them without ceremony because there was no other way forward. Colonel Shoup, his leg wound now infected and seeping through makeshift bandages, surveyed what remained of his command. The 2nd Marine Division had landed with over 18,000 men. A third of them were casualties. Some battalions existed only in name, their companies reduced to squads, their squads to fire teams. Yet they held the beach, the airfield, and most of the western half of the island. The question now was whether they had enough left to finish it. The answer came not from strategy, but from stubbornness. The Marines had crossed an invisible line somewhere in the blood and coral of the first day, the point where retreat became impossible not because of orders, but because too many had died to make turning back anything other than betrayal. They would take Betio, or they would die on it. There was no third option. At 0700 hours, the final push began. Tanks led the way, their treads grinding over debris and bodies with equal indifference. Behind them came the infantry, fewer now, moving with the mechanical efficiency of men who had stopped thinking and simply acted. They cleared bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers. They shot Japanese soldiers who emerged from tunnels with their hands raised, not out of cruelty, but because too many Marines had died to tricks, to false surrenders, to booby-trapped corpses. Trust had been burned away along with everything else. The fighting took on a rhythm: advance 10 yards, encounter resistance, suppress, flank, destroy, advance again. Japanese defenders fought from spider holes, from trenches, from rubble piles that yesterday had been command posts. They fired until their ammunition ran out, then charged with bayonets, then with swords, then with bare hands. Almost none surrendered. Those who tried were often shot by their own officers before the Marines could reach them. By noon, the Marines had reached the eastern end of the island. A small pocket of Japanese defenders held out in a final bunker complex near the eastern beach. Major William Jones, commanding what remained of the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, called for artillery. Shells pounded the position for 20 minutes. When the barrage lifted, Jones led the assault personally, a pistol in one hand, a grenade in the other. He reached the bunker entrance and looked inside. Bodies were stacked 3 deep. The walls were painted red. Nothing moved. He turned to his men and said simply, "It's over." The words felt too small for what they meant. 76 hours after the 1st Marines hit the reef, Betio was secure. Admiral Shibasaki's fortress, the island that could not be taken in 100 years, had fallen in just over 3 days. But the cost of proving him wrong lay scattered across every yard of coral. The butcher's bill came in slowly, counted in aid stations and on transport ships, in the shallow graves dug behind the seawall and the bodies that would never be recovered from the lagoon. 1,027 Marines killed, 2,292 wounded, numbers that landed like blows when read aloud. The 2nd Marine Division had suffered more casualties in 76 hours than any Marine unit had suffered in any single battle in the Corps' history. The Japanese dead numbered 4,690. Of the nearly 5,000 defenders, only 17 surrendered, and most of those were Korean laborers, not combat troops. The Special Naval Landing Forces had fought to virtual annihilation, just as their orders demanded. Admiral Shibasaki's promise had been half right. 1 million men could not have taken Tarawa in 100 years. But 5,000 Marines had done it in 76 hours, and the price they paid for disproving him would echo through the rest of the war. In the days that followed, the island became a grim tourist site for correspondents and commanders trying to understand what had happened. Robert Sherrard walked the beach, his notebook filled with descriptions that his editors would later soften because the truth was too harsh for breakfast tables. He wrote of bodies bloated in the sun, of the smell that drove strong men to vomiting, of the craters filled with seawater and blood where Marines had drowned under fire. "This," he wrote, "is what it costs to take 300 acres of coral from men who will not surrender." General Julian Smith, who had requested more bombardment, more Amtraks, more time. It arrived on Betio on the fourth day. He stood on the beach where his Marines had died by the hundreds and wept openly. An aide tried to comfort him, but Smith shook his head. "They were right to be afraid," he said quietly, "and I sent them anyway." It was not guilt, exactly, but the heavy knowledge that command means choosing who will die and hoping their deaths purchase something worth the price. The lessons of Tarawa were written in blood but learned quickly. Naval bombardment doctrine changed immediately. Instead of hours, future assaults would receive days of shelling. Amtraks went from experimental to essential, with production tripled overnight. Close air support, which had been sporadic at Tarawa, became standard procedure. The Marines developed new tactics for bunker warfare, new equipment for coral islands, new protocols for everything from communications to casualty evacuation. But the most profound lesson was psychological. Tarawa taught the American military that Japanese defenders would fight to the death, that fortified positions required not just firepower but fanaticism to overcome, and that the road to Tokyo would be paved with battles like this one. Every island, from here to Japan, would be a smaller Tarawa, each demanding its own butcher's bill, each testing whether American will could outlast Japanese desperation. In Japan, the news of Tarawa's fall was suppressed for weeks. When it finally emerged, heavily censored, the propaganda machine spun it as a heroic last stand. Admiral Shibasaki was posthumously promoted and praised for his courage. His boast that 1,000,000 men could not take the island in 100 years was conveniently forgotten. But among the military leadership in Tokyo, Tarawa's fall in 76 hours sent a darker message. If the Americans were willing to pay this price for a speck of coral in the middle of the Pacific, what would they pay for Saipan, for Iwo Jima, for Okinawa, for Japan itself? The answer would come island by island over the next 2 years. But Tarawa had set the terms. Speed, violence, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat would characterize American amphibious warfare for the rest of the conflict. The Marines who survived would carry the lessons with them. Many would land again at Saipan, at Tinian, at Peleliu. They would know what to expect now. The fear would not lessen, but the surprise was gone. Back in the United States, the photographs from Tarawa caused a sensation. Life magazine published them in stark black and white. Americans saw their sons floating face down in the surf, piled against seawalls, sprawled in positions that suggested they had died mid-stride. The images shocked a nation that had grown accustomed to sanitized war news. Parents wrote to Congress demanding explanations. The military, caught between honesty and morale, struggled to frame Tarawa as a victory without dishonoring the dead. President Roosevelt, reviewing the casualty reports, asked his military advisers if such losses were necessary. The answer was brutally simple. Yes, Mr. President, and Tarawa is only the beginning. The Central Pacific Drive continued. Within 6 months, American forces would take Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Saipan, Guam. Each assault would be better planned than Tarawa. Each would cost fewer lives, but none would erase the memory of those 76 hours when Marines learned the true price of fortified coral. For the survivors, Tarawa became a marker, a dividing line between who they had been and who the war had made them. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, who would later fight at Peleliu and Okinawa, wrote that Marines who had been at Tarawa moved differently, spoke differently, carried themselves with a kind of exhausted authority that new replacements could feel but not understand. They had seen something, Sledge wrote, that changed them at a level we couldn't reach. Colonel Shoup, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his leadership on Betio, never spoke publicly about the battle without acknowledging the cost. When asked years later if he was proud of Tarawa, he answered, "Proud of the men, not proud that it was necessary." His leg wound never fully healed. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, a physical reminder of 3 days that had tested the limits of human endurance. The island itself was quickly transformed. Engineers filled in the craters, bulldozed the rubble, expanded the airfield. Within weeks, American bombers were using Hawkins Field to strike targets in the Marshall Islands. The palm trees that survived were cut down for better sight lines. The bunkers were collapsed or buried. The bodies were removed, first the Americans to cemeteries in Hawaii, then the Japanese to mass graves at the island's edge. By Christmas of 1943, barely a month after the battle, Betio looked like any other American base. Quonset huts, supply dumps, a control tower, and rows of aircraft gleaming in the tropical sun. Sailors on liberty walked the beaches where Marines had died, unaware that the coral beneath their feet had been purchased with blood. The war moved on, as wars do, leaving the dead to fade into history and the living to carry their ghosts. But on the eastern tip of Betio, near where Major Jones had declared the battle over, someone planted a simple wooden cross. No name on it, no rank, no unit. Just a cross driven into the coral, marking nothing and everything. Marines passing by would sometimes stop, remove their helmets, and stand in silence. They did not pray, exactly. They simply remembered. Remembered the reef, the seawall, the bunkers that would not break. Remembered the boys from Nebraska and Ohio and Texas who had waded into that lagoon believing in victory and found only mathematics. Years later, historians would debate whether Tarawa was necessary, whether the island could have been bypassed, whether the casualties were justified by the strategic gains. The questions were valid, but they missed the point. Tarawa was necessary not because of the island itself, but because it taught both sides what this war would demand. It showed the Japanese that American firepower and determination could overcome any defense. It showed the Americans that Japanese fanaticism would require not just victory, but annihilation. Admiral Shibasaki had been wrong about 1,000,000 men and 100 years, but he had been right about one thing. Taking Tarawa had required a price that tested the soul of a nation. 76 hours to take 300 acres. 1,027 dead to silence, 4,690. The mathematics were brutal and simple, and they would be repeated, with variations, across every island between Tarawa and Tokyo. In the end, the island that could not be taken was taken. The fortress that would stand for a century fell in 3 days. But the men who took it were changed forever, shaped by coral and blood into something harder than steel and more fragile than memory. They had learned what their fathers in the trenches of France had learned a generation before, that modern war consumes the brave and the cowardly with equal appetite, that courage is measured not in what you win, but in what you endure, and that some victories cost so much that the price becomes part of the prize itself. The sun set over Betio on the evening of November 22nd, 1943, painting the lagoon gold and red. The water was calm now, the bodies cleared, the guns silent. Somewhere in the distance, a Marine played a harmonica, the notes drifting across the island like smoke. The song was one the Japanese had sung too, in their own language, in their own bunkers, before the end came for them. It was a song about going home. Most of the men who had fought on Betio, on both sides, would never hear it again. But for 76 hours they had shared this coral hell, and in sharing it had written a chapter of history that neither nation would forget. The island had been taken, the mathematics had been proven, and the cost, as always, was counted in the young. Thank you. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.